Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Delta Waterfowl's The Voice of the Duck Hunter podcast. On today's podcast, we shine a spotlight on the Klamath Basin National Wildlife Refuge Complex in southern Oregon and northern California. In case you haven't heard, this part of the world has been under the grip of a long-term drought that has resulted in habitat management struggles and even hunting season closures on two of the most storied hunting properties in the region. To help me cover today's topic, I'm joined by John Vradenburg of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and Jeff Adams, Regional Event Director for Delta Waterfowl. With that introduction, let's bring in today's guests. John Vradenburg and Jeff Adams, welcome to the Delta Waterfowl podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks very much.
Yes, sir. Yes, sirs. I have to say yes, sirs. So, John Vradenburg, you are with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. I'm going to read your title. I'm a cheater. Supervisory Biologist for the Klamath Basin Complex for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. As I understand it, your territory spans, I'm going to say it right, like a local, Oregon and California. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. And Jeff Adams, why don't you tell everybody what your role here at Delta Waterfowl is?
Okay, so I'm the Regional Director for what I call the Intermountain States, Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, and Nevada, and then also our beautiful golden state of California.
That's a big turf. That's a really big turf. You must put a lot of miles on your truck, Jeff.
A handful, sir.
Yeah. John, when you call someone like Jeff at Delta, I don't know about you if you ever chat with him, but you usually hear tires humming in the background when you call him.
Yeah, generally.
Yeah, the mobile office. Yeah, I have to back up there. Oregon, I have a friend who grew up in Oregon, and I'm from Wisconsin. And in Wisconsin, we say Oregon, and he would always correct me and say it's when you're from there, it's Oregon, right? Do I have it right?
You have it right. Yep.
So he'll be proud of me. He'll be proud of me. So, guys, we're just to not bury the lead, I'm going to push it back a little bit, but just for the listener's sake. The reason, John, we asked you to come on here, and Jeff, obviously, this is an area that professionally you're very interested in, but John, the West, the Pacific Northwest, has been experiencing severe drought that has led to, I guess, a very negative impact on hunting at least a couple of the national wildlife refuges in the complex that you are, I guess, a biologist for or supervisory biologist for. And we thought it was a good opportunity, one, for those that aren't from that part of the world, just to share the challenges that both managers and hunters are going to face, but then also for those local to have a better understanding of the situation and just for them to learn how difficult and how challenging this can be. So I appreciate that. But before we get into the meat of it, John Vradenburg, can you give us just a little personal background? Just go a couple minutes into, where are you from? What led you to be a biologist?
Sure. So, I was actually born in Minnesota and spent a lot of my early life with my grandparents up in northern Minnesota, up by Grand Rapids. We have a cabin up there. So I guess I got my love of the outdoors from stomping around in the woods there and walking with my grandpa chasing grouse and looking at ducks on the lake and fishing and all those things you do as a kid. And then about in third grade, my parents moved to Colorado Springs, Colorado. So I spent my early years loving the woods and then spent the rest of my life stuck in a big city wanting to be outdoors every weekend. And it was hard to get out. So I spent a lot of time looking over magazines and reading everything I could about duck hunting and writing down goals of what I wanted to be in my life. And the first goal I wrote down was I wanted to be a waterfowl biologist and went through school, got lucky enough to go to the University of Missouri where I got picked up by Lee Frederickson as a graduate student doing a wetland project looking at forested bottomlands in southeast Missouri. And then got lucky enough to move back to Colorado, to southern Colorado in the San Luis Valley, which is, kind of Colorado's iconic wetland complexes, to do wetland management. And from there, I was picked up by the Fish and Wildlife Service at Bosque del Apache in southern New Mexico, where I sort of specialized in arid wetland systems, and got to travel all over the Western United States and a couple places internationally to talk about arid wetland systems. And when the opportunity came up to work in the Klamath Basin, it was one of those once in a lifetime opportunities. I mean, the Klamath Basin is, for the Fish and Wildlife Service, it's just sort of a storied complex. Lower Klamath National Wildlife Refuge was the first refuge in the Fish and Wildlife Service established specifically for migratory waterfowl in 1908. There were a couple of other refuges before that, but it was the first, be specifically designated for the purpose of migratory water birds. And, if you think about it from the context of continental water bird management, that set the template for establishing this amazing refuge system we have across the continent. And so the opportunity to work here and be part of the Klamath Basin was just something I couldn't pass up. And my predecessor, Dave Mauser, had really set a nice template for me to come in and start to do good stuff. And so that's how I got here. And that's about my background. Just a kid that loved ducks, and now I still love ducks. I like banding them more than chasing them, I guess. But
yeah, I have to be careful here. Sometimes I get on these tangents. I bite onto some flashy subject, and I want to learn more about it. But arid wetland systems, that sounds like an oxymoron. Tell me a little bit more about that.
Yeah, it does. That's what I get from everybody. So arid systems are those areas that, evaporation and transpiration exceed your annual precipitation. So these are systems that have, really high rates of ET. So they tend to, they function differently. We have different salinity issues, different water budget challenges. But for a lot of them, they tend to be in these big intermountain basins where you get this like massive snowfall that happens off site. And then you get this delivery of water to these basins. And they're really cool systems. So a lot of them are either basins or riparian systems. Like I was working at New Mexico, was along the Rio Grande. But for these mid-continent areas, they're just really essential for getting birds, from the breeding grounds to the wintering grounds and back and forth. But, the basin, the Klamath Basin, just like the San Luis Valley or even the Salt Lake system where Jeff is up by, these were really unique systems because they could meet the annual life cycle requirements across all annual life cycles. So we tend to have an abundance of species across abundance of life cycles across the year. I mean, they're just super productive, super reliable wetland ecosystems. And, to put into context, we don't have many of them. There's just not many of these big intermountain basins. And for the Pacific Flyway, you have three of them. You have the Salt Lake, the Klamath, or Sonic, and the Klamath Basin, and the Central Valley. That's what we have. And all of those are seeing the same pressures that we're seeing here in the Klamath. I mean, water scarcity is definitely compromising wetland habitat across the Western United States.
So your work in New Mexico transferred directly, more or less, to the situation you're in right now?
Somewhat. I mean, a little different. I mean, that was a riparian system, and we didn't have organic soils like we do here. I mean, these basins tend to have really rich, abundant organic soils or big peat layers. And so different wetland processes, different, everything responds differently in an organic system. So the Middle Rio Grande was a little different, a lot flashier, and much more a staging area than, it was just available during that, fall, winter, spring migration period. Then it went dry. Where here we have wetlands across season in most years.
Okay, no, that's a really good introduction. I do want to learn a little bit more about the complex, but just to be balanced here, and Jeff, I want to ask you real fast here. So Jeff, you are a regional director, so you have a territory that you described, and you recruit volunteers, both for fundraising, but then also one of the awesome things about Delta is that our chapters are allowed to do local projects with a portion of the funds that they raise. And so you're a real boots on the ground guy. What is the interest, Jeff, for this Northern California, Southern Oregon? What is the interest from our duck hunter constituent in that part of the world?
It is massive for our volunteers and for the guests who go to our banquets and other hunters. It is a huge destination for early season hunters to go to. In fact, I heard from several committee members, and I'll say mostly in the Central Valley, who were planning on going up and hunting Tule Lake for the early season this year. And, when the news come out, it's just, holy cow, now what do we do? Where do we go? I'll mention Steve DeBerry. Steve DeBerry and other volunteers we have in the Eagle Point and Medford area of Southern Oregon, they rely on this area for the bulk of their hunting without traveling great distances. And so these refuges that John is fortunate enough to take care of are not only absolute critical stopovers for migratory birds going north and south a couple of times a year, they're critical for the hunting public on the Pacific coast. I've heard it said that as things have gradually gotten worse and worse with the drought and other factors over, I'll say, the last 10 to 12 years, I hear of hunters talk about how the birds, when they cannot stop and molt and spend that pre-staging time, if you will, at the Klamath Falls marshes, their next stop, very honestly, is the Butte Sinks and the rice fields of Northern California, and then even working a little bit further south into the beautiful refuges and state-owned complexes that they have in California, from the Sacramento National Wildlife Refuge to so many others, all the way down to YOLO. And the problem that happens, guys, when it comes to hunters and even for ducks in the fall migration, and John, you guys are both biologists. I am not. So you can correct me if I'm way off base here. But my understanding from our volunteers is the problem is that as soon as triggers start getting pulled in the Butte Sinks, and what we used to have for flooded rice fields, but we don't even have those now, the ducks then move on and head on down towards Sacramento and YOLO if there's water there, which there won't even be water there when the season starts this year. So ultimately what this does is it puts more pressure on the ultimate wintering grounds for the Pacific Flyway, which is the Central Valley.
John, does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, what we're seeing is, it's a challenging situation when you look at, water bird ecology and cumulative effects and all that stuff that happen. As birds can't stage, they're in poor body condition when they get to the wintering grounds. If they can't overwinter good, they're in poor condition going back north. If they can't get good resources going back north, it's just putting birds are constantly in an energetic deficit at this point. And when you look at a year like this, where, we're going to have a relatively good fall flight, they're going to hit the mid-continent. We don't have any of the historic staging areas in line ready for those birds. And then we look at the Central Valley being in such bad condition this year. I mean, they're talking in places where at, 80% reduction in rice availability. Those birds are more than likely going to end up in Mexico. And we're excited that monsoons have been good in Mexico, but we don't know, what that energetic demand is going to be on birds just having to make these bigger hops. All the grocery stores have been shut down from Canada to Mexico, so it's a little bit rougher year for those guys this year.
Yeah, it's a tale of many problems from the sound of it. John, let's go back up the flyway, let's say, to where you are. And I'd like to learn and share with the listener, have the listener learn a little bit more about this Klamath Basin complex. Let's look at a little bit more of the structure of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. There are different regions. So the United States is broken into regions, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service regions. And then inside you have complexes, you have wetland management districts. How is California, that Northern California, Southern Oregon area divided? What region do you just have refuges in that complex, or are there other types of federal property or interest in the complex?
Yeah, we do. So California is sort of the boundary between Region 1 and Region 8. Region 1 being the Pacific Northwest, and we're the Southern Pacific office. But the Klamath Basin, because of the watershed and the, several of the species that are linked to the Klamath watershed, Region 8 comes a little bit up into the Klamath Basin and encompasses most of the Klamath River watershed. And so outside of the refuges, there is strong interest. We have a endangered species office based out of the Klamath Falls in Region 8, and then we also have a newly developed fish hatchery getting established for endangered species recovery. Um, so yeah, we do have other interest in the Klamath Basin for sure. Water birds are a big issue, anadromous fish are a big issue. Some of our endemic um, desert fish species are an issue here for the Fish and Wildlife Service. So there's a lot going on related to resource management in the Klamath Basin, and then we work really collaboratively with the refuges in the Central Valley. So I almost look at it as we're sort of a northern extension of the Central Valley, and by the way we were sort of established and developed, I mean, one of our management objectives is to stage as many birds as possible in the Central Valley to delay that migration into the Central Valley to help prevent depredation issues. And as the basin has become drier and drier, we're staging fewer and fewer birds. Pre 2000, I would say, I mean, we were staging 80% of the migratory population of waterfowl coming down before they would get into the Central Valley, and that would help offset, that early migration and really the depredation in the rice production areas in Central Valley. And that's just getting harder and harder to do. And, most of the white fronts just pass over the Klamath Basin now. The majority of early pintails, early greenwings all bypass the Klamath Basin. But there's a lot going on in terms of resource management in the Klamath Basin for sure.
Okay, so we talked about this before I hit the record button, but the Klamath Basin Complex, 6 national wildlife refuges, 3 of them in Oregon, 3 in California. Is that right?
Yep.
And then for you as the supervisory biologist for that entire complex, those entire 6 refuges, you had mentioned before that you have other staff, other biologists that you manage and work with. Can you share with the listener a little bit about that situation?
Yep. So I have a wildlife biologist, and then I have an integrated pest management specialist that does all of our invasive work and helps oversee our farming program. And then we have a biotech that helps with water management and invasive species, as well as we try to get several seasonal employees during the summer to help support primarily the invasive species problems. And then if we get lucky enough and can get funding, I try to have at least 1 or 2 graduate students on the complex in any one year, just helping us. I'm always trying to keep science at the forefront of what we do and try to keep on the edge of science and keep pushing that forward. And the best way to do that is collaborating with universities or USGS and bringing graduate students in. So right now we have 1 graduate student finishing up a sage grouse study. We have another graduate student working on a seed bank study, and another one that's just getting started on a yellow rail, short emergent perennial wetland graduate study. So we just try to keep our hands in science all the time. But it gets harder and harder with conditions changing. It's harder to come up with a graduate study that you have assurance of resources throughout their period of study. For example, the one student we have doing the seed bank, she was originally funded to do an overwater nesting water bird study, and with the loss of habitat, we just didn't have any habitat for her to do that. So we switched to a seed bank study, just trying to keep her going and get some new data for science.
Okay. So most complexes or refuges certainly do. They have a goal, a mission, a purpose. And you had mentioned before that staging, basically staging meaning kind of holding migratory ducks and geese. I've heard of this area having a good reputation as a breeding ground as well. Do you manage any of these individual refuges or the complex for breeding waterfowl as well?
We do, and I guess that probably deserves a little bit of history on the Klamath just to put that into perspective. So I mean, it's important to recognize that prior to the 1900s, this was a huge wetland basin. I mean, wetlands defined this landscape. There were 6 really big wetland complexes. You could call them wetland/lake complexes that covered Southern Oregon and Northern California. It was roughly 350,000 acres of semi-permanent wetland and about 140,000 acres of seasonal wet meadow habitat. And so Lower Klamath specifically, like I described, when it was established, it was an 80,000 acre lake, perennial wetland lake. And that establishment really came about because of a naturalist named William Finley that was sent down to the Klamath to sort of document, the extent of wetlands and the bird diversity. And what really stuck in Finley's mind was the abundance of colonial water birds. It wasn't even waterfowl that he was intrigued by. There were millions of waterfowl, but it was this colonial overwater nesting waterbird population that was here. So lots of grebes, ibis, pelicans, cormorants, terns, things like that. And so as the landscape changed and wetlands were slowly converted over to different land uses, Tule Lake and Lower Klamath especially became critical because they were the last big remnant of that once massive wetland footprint. And so our purposes really revolve around all of those. Yes, staging is what we're known for because it was such, in the 1950s, we were staging 7 million birds in the Klamath Basin at any one peak during the migration. But the way these wetlands function, they're perennial wetlands for the most part. And so breeding has always been a huge part of this refuge complex. I mean, we produce a lot of water birds, a lot of waterfowl specifically. And I would say even more importantly than the production that happened, we are the primary molting location for all of those birds that breed in Central Valley, especially California mallards, gadwall, and cinnamon teal, as well as birds that are breeding throughout the Southern Oregon, Northeastern California area. When I first got here at any one time, and we could have 200,000 to 300,000 molting birds on the Tule Lake complex. I mean, we are a huge, huge molting area. And that for California specifically, that's just such a critically limiting period of time for those nesting birds in California. So they come up here. We have really abundant submerged aquatic vegetation. So that means a lot of invertebrates. So for those birds that are just going through molt, it's a really protein rich system. They can get up here, they can molt fast. We have a lot of tall emergent habitat so they can get out of the sun. So it's critical for that. So I would say, when you read the establishing purposes of the refuge, it's for nesting and migrating water birds. And that's really, if we can have perennial wetlands, we're going to produce a lot of birds, but we're going to support a lot of birds during the migration period as well.
It's quite a multi-purpose complex. It serves, I guess, based on the time of the year, very critical support mechanism for birds in the Pacific Flyway. That's interesting. You said at one point the complex would hold 80% of, was it the Pacific Flyway ducks and geese migrating? That's incredible.
Yeah, they all kind of come through here. I mean, we're one of those, we're like the Platte. I mean, we're one of those energetic bottlenecks on the landscape where you have these birds coming out of the really wetland abundant northern breeding grounds. And then there's just not much wetland habitat. So they come out of Salt Lake, they go through Malheur Lake, and they all pinch right here going through the Klamath Basin, and then they spread out. It's just like that neck of the hourglass. We are the neck right here. We are generally really abundant and very energetically lacking requirements on the landscape. And so we're critical to helping birds make it from the north end of the flyway to the south end and back up.
Okay, so some of the self-study I did before getting on this conversation was that complex is about 250,000 acres in size.
Yep.
Is that right?
Yep.
That's impressive. So obviously things have changed. We're going to focus in on that change here in just a second. But what is the complex's relationship to hunting? Has hunting been, of course, on refuges, there are areas that hunting by definition is not allowed, but most refuges that I'm familiar with at least allow hunting on certain locations or certain conditions. Can you describe the relationship to hunting inside this complex?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it would be an understatement to say that the refuges in the Klamath Basin are an iconic destination location for waterfowl hunters. As a kid, like I said, I got interested in the Klamath when I was a kid because you couldn't pick up Field and Stream, Outdoor Life, Ducks Unlimited, any of those magazines without an article on hunting in the Klamath Basin. And for hunters in California, like Jeff had said, this was the place everybody came to start their season, and people traveled from. I mean, they came from all over the place to hunt the Klamath Basin historically. And I mentioned to you guys before the podcast started, the little town of Tule Lake here was said to be the biggest depot for Winchester ammunition south of the Mississippi River. I mean, they would bring it in by the rail car loads because there were so many hunters coming into the basin. And there's old videos and stuff that you can find on YouTube where there's a highway that, we call it State Line Highway. It splits Oregon and California. I mean, there would be hundreds of people in campers and trailers camping along that highway throughout the season, just to hunt these refuges. And it was a huge economic input to our community. It drove a lot. Agriculture is the big driver in the community, but outside of the agricultural period, that was a tremendous economic input for the small businesses, restaurants, sporting goods stores, hardware stores, hotels, any lodging. And there were so many hunters here that there was a down industry in Tule Lake. They had, I think it was 7 or 8 plucking plants that hunters would bring their ducks in, and they would harvest them and use that down to feed the down industry. And the last one just went out of business just a few years ago. It was actually on a episode of Dirty Jobs with Mike Rhodes. They were plucking ducks at that place. So it was just huge. It was a huge economic part of our community. It's part of the fabric of the Klamath Basin. You don't meet somebody in the Klamath Basin that's not a duck hunter or isn't attached to duck hunting in some way. It's part of everybody's DNA in this basin.
Well, despite the sad story, this sounds like it's my kind of place.
Right? It's a cool place.
Yeah. What is it? So you said, a destination hunting location. What is it that drew people? Was it access? Was it a diversity of duck species? Just the sheer size of the fall flight coming through that location? What is it that people would find of interest?
I think it was all of those things. I mean, it was massive numbers of birds. It was an incredible amount of access. I mean, we have so much public land. I mean, just on the refuges alone, when we were at full capacity, I mean, between Lower Klamath and Tule Lake, I mean, you're talking about, Tule Lake alone is 15,000 acres of wetlands, and Lower Klamath, when it was, in its heyday, was another 15 to 20,000 acres of perennial wetlands. And then you start throwing on the flooding of agriculture and the flooding of seasonal wetlands, and you could be looking at 45, 50,000 acres of wetland habitat available, for the most part available to hunters. It was early in the season, so it's generally 2 or 3 weeks before the Southern California season started, so guys could get a jump on their hunting. It's just a spectacular landscape on top of it. I mean, we're surrounded by mountains to the south. We have, Shasta Mountain, which it's 14,000 feet and has a glacier on it. So it's always these white capped mountains around there. And it's just an amazing landscape. And, when you layer in, 4 or 5 million birds buzzing around the basin all morning long, the stories that the old timers talk about of this place, nobody even went out to hunt until 8 o'clock in the morning because the birds would disperse out of the refuge and feed in all the grain fields around the refuge. And then the mallards would start coming back at 9 or 10, and guys would boat out to these big holes in the Tule marshes and have these, amazing mallard hunts. And, so I think it was a lot of that. I think there's something to be said about traditional locations. We were, you could argue we were kind of like Stuttgart to Pacific flyaway hunters. Mm-hmm. We were just one of those places that was reliable. It was known for waterfowl hunting. There was tradition and outfitters and resources to partake in it. And it's just, like I said, it's part of the DNA of this place. You can't go into a building and there's not ducks mounted and guns hanging from people's doors and pictures that people got at some banquet somewhere, just on every restaurant, every insurance store. The Tule Lake High School mascot is the honker. So it's something about the community.
So yeah, you know it's a part of the community when it kind of becomes the school mascot
Yeah.
for the local school. Now that's interesting. So John and Jeff, one of I've always known that I wanted to be a biologist or a wildlife manager, and waterfowl as a person always struck my interest simply because of just how dynamic wetland systems are. And one of the things that I've been known to say is I've always grown up in the north where there's winter and wetlands freeze, and it becomes a pretty scarce landscape when you're talking about, well, birds in particular, but also most forms of wildlife. And so waterfowl have always had that I guess that attraction. But as a manager, I was drawn to waterfowl, one as an opportunity to give back to that resource that I cared so much about, but the other one, try as you might, you'll never figure out waterfowl. You'll never figure out waterfowl populations, wetland systems, and mostly because things are always changing. Just when you think you might have it figured out, Mother Nature throws something your way, and changes your understanding, changes the way, I guess, waterfowl populations interact with the landscape. And it sounds like your part of the world is no stranger to that, in that try as you might, the world is changing around you. Jeff, I heard you say, John, I heard you say that, you're talking about things changing for the worse, 10, 15, 20 years ago? What is the time, for this modern day story of lack of water, drought, I guess pressures on these water systems? When did things, I guess in modern times, start to take a turn for the worse, John?
Yeah. So, like I said, the 1950s they're kind of that target area when things were still working. The basin had went through most of its big, human caused modifications that altered the landscape, but it was still working. There was a lot of water on the landscape. It was flowing, through the basin, through the refuges. And it's important to recognize the two refuges we're talking about sit at the bottom end of a really big irrigation system. And so they're really reliant on any of that return flow that comes through the system. And, I started out saying these were these big peat systems. And these big peat systems are super, I like to say they're super resilient to climatic and hydrologic change because they have the capacity to store a ton of water and get you through really dry periods. And so as long as there was water flowing across the landscape, the peat soils were, storing a lot of water, and there was always an abundance of water coming back out of the system, flowing through the refuges and then flowing back out to the Klamath River. And that was really working up until about the 2000s. And 2000 is 2001's famous in the Klamath Basin because that's when we had the first really big water shut off in the Klamath Basin, due to a lot of concerns with anadromous fish runs. Water just wasn't making it into the Klamath. It was changing the water quality, the water temperatures, and anadromous fish were really getting hit hard by a lot of those changes in the ecology of the system. So there was a lot of things started to change in terms of water management. And at that time, 2000 is also when we started to recognize the climate was starting to change pretty dramatically in the Pacific Northwest. We were really, it's interesting. In the Pacific Northwest, we have historically a very consistent wet dry cycle. And it spans about 20 years. It's a, multi-decadal cycle. We go in through this kind of big drought and deluge cycle, really similar to the prairie potholes, where we've got really extreme drought on one end and really extreme wet on the other end. But with climate change, that's becoming prolonged. The periods between wet and the periods between dry are becoming longer, and they're becoming much more variable. And so if snowpack starts to change in the Cascades and around the Klamath Basin, that really affects the amount of water coming into the system. And in a modern system, water is allocated to a lot of different users, refuges being one. And so as that becomes tighter, it's harder to have, that reliability of water in the landscape. So as the landscape starts to dry, that resiliency starts to shift. And that's what we're, in what I'm seeing on the refuges, that's what we're really starting to see. There's less water being spread across the landscape, and you're taking that resilience that nature really built into this system, and you're removing that resilience. And so that's where we're at right now. What the drought has done, when we try to characterize the impacts of drought right now, these really extreme drought conditions have really compromised the availability of water to be spread out amongst all of those users that have a right to use the water or a need for that water. And as you take that supply down, there's less going to those environmental benefits, like storage in the ground or return flows that come back to the rivers and make it to the refuges. And that's where we're at right now. So what we need is we need water back in the system. We need that climate to shift back to that wet cycle and put the abundance back in that helps keep the resilience on the landscape. And that's a lot harder to plan for because we are so dry now. And I really classify it as the Klamath Basin as a whole is getting pushed towards desertification right now because, similar to the prairies, as you start to squeeze all that moisture out of those organic soils, they compress, they mineralize, they start to, put off carbon, put off phosphorus, they become less productive, and you squeeze out those natural processes that made them really available to store, have that water storing capacity. And, so it's a lot harder to see what the future is going to look like until we get a better prediction on what water availability is going to look like in the future.
It's the world that you live in is really foreign to me. I think that, not to get political, but I grew up watching a lot of Westerns. I think I've watched every John Wayne movie, and water, I guess, competing for water, that's a centuries old discussion. And so kind of what you're saying there is, yes, the landscape has changed, land converted wetlands over time, cropland, whatever it may be. So on one hand, so it's competing interests for the water, or growing competition for I guess the access to water, coupled with drought. And then, like you said, I think sounds like if you're in a drought, the current trend is to stay in it longer.
Yeah.
Would that be okay? So to back up there, just for the sake of the listener, can you give the listener an example when you say anadromous fish? What different types of fish species are you referring to?
Yeah. So we're talking about, any of those fish that, use fresh and saltwater environments. So the salmon species, steelhead, some of the lampreys, and there's several other smaller fish species that use the Klamath that are anadromous fish species. And they come out of the Pacific and make a big spawning run up the Klamath and to its tributaries. And then in the upper basin, we also have endemic desert fish species that use these wetlands and lake systems as well.
That's really complicated. I think it's kind of one of those. I remember learning if you're gonna tinker with an engine, you kind of need to save all the parts. So if we're thinking of kind of a mechanic analogy, and I think as a biologist or manager, wow, there's just so many competing interests for both human and I guess natural systems interests that I don't even. That's just amazing to think of. More of the desert fish species. The salmon. Now, the salmon, the concern there is it's just flows of the rivers that they're using for travel and breeding, I suppose, right?
Yeah, it's a lot of things. I mean, it's water temperature, it's water quality, it's flow. There's a lot of things tied to those riverine systems that the fish coming out of the Pacific require. And so there's a lot going on. And I'm definitely not a fish biologist, so I don't want to dabble in their arena. But
I just like to catch them, John.
Yeah, but it's an important resource culturally and economically, and just similar to our, what we have going on up here in the basin. There's cultural and economic needs related to all this stuff.
Okay, so water is managed. It's not managed in my part of the world. I think I know of one person, maybe two, that pumps water in either of North Dakota or South Dakota. One, maybe two. But in other parts of the world, the deep south, your part of the world, it's commonplace. Mm-hmm. So it is super, super foreign to me. But so in your part of the world, people can buy water rights, they can buy water allocations. What is the complex's relationship to water? And you said where it's supplied, but mm-hmm. do you have any guaranteed access to water or receipt of water at the complex?
At this point, we do have water rights, but the word guaranteed is not necessarily the best word for our water rights, primarily due to supply and other demands. So we do have access to some water rights. We do have some water that's allocated to us in the winter, and we do have options for water purchases that we are looking into. California Waterfowl Association recently just purchased a water right for us. It's a small water right, but an important water right in terms of where it can go to and the habitat it can provide. But the word guaranteed is definitely not a word we use for water when it comes to the refuges. And it's really complicated and probably something we can't get into in this podcast, but at this point, I mean, and I would say we're not the only ones. I mean, I would say every water user tied to water in the Klamath would say the same thing. The guarantee of water is not there. And that's, primarily driven to that shift that we're seeing in, precipitation patterns at this time right now.
Well, you can't guarantee what doesn't exist, I would imagine is probably the case when many feed at the trough, somebody has to feed last.
Yeah.
And someone might run out. So this is extreme drought. How long has this recent drought period been in existence?
Yeah, so we've been in sort of a prolonged drought for, arguably the past 20 years, but the past 3 years have been by far the most extreme we've seen. I mean, we've had one average year of precipitation. Last year was kind of sub-average, but the previous 2 years, I mean, we were sub 50% snowpack in the mountains. And combined with that, we're getting warmer in the spring. And so the release of that water is happening much earlier. And so when you get that release earlier, some of those natural processes I was talking about are really hard to engage because you may have frost in the soil. So you're not getting that bank storage that you would get in your riparian corridors. The flows may be low enough that you're not getting flood events that are inundating the floodplains. And so you're not getting that kind of storage. And those are really important. You want those floodplains to inundate so they get saturated and then they help that flow maintain longer through the year. And so, the earlier things happen, it just changes how the system processes water. And that makes a big difference in what's available to be used. If it all comes out early, it's gone. And you really want that snowpack to stay in the mountains as long as possible. You want it to melt really slow. You want it to release for as long a period of time as possible. And you want it to come down in a volume that engages those floodplains and stores the water where nature intended it to be stored so it can, leak out throughout the summer and help maintain those conditions. And, that's where the wetlands were really critical in the Klamath Basin because they had such water storage capacity during a flood period, but because they were so big and their wetland footprint was so large, they had tremendous capacity to get us through those drought periods. And so a lot of times you hear, you'll hear wetlands talked about as like the kidney of the landscape because they help clean water. Well, in the Klamath, they were the heart of the landscape. They were the heart, they were the kidneys, and they were the lungs of this landscape. And so when you start to remove critical parts of your body, bad things start to happen. You don't have kidneys, you don't have a heart, you don't have a lung, you're not going to be around a whole lot longer. And so that's where we kind of have to get back to that recognition of the importance of wetlands. And a lot of times that gets hard to do because, everywhere wetlands have been on the landscape, as we marched forward and progress marched forward, wetlands were always looked at these as these impediments to progress, these kind of wastelands on the landscape. And we just didn't have the nuance of understanding the role wetlands played to all of our health and well-being. And we really got to get that back into the conversation if we want to see these values that, we're talking about here on this podcast. I mean, if we want waterfowl back on the landscape, we got to get wetlands back on the landscape first. And, you talked about, being interested in waterfowl, as a waterfowl manager. And I would say that's what kind of pushed me into wetlands. I wanted to be a waterfowl biologist so bad, and realized early on that my statistical prowess was not going to be strong enough to be a very good waterfowl biologist. And I really got interested in wetlands early on. And that was what I saw as my way of giving back. If I can produce really productive, really abundant wetlands that are available at the right time, I can do a lot of good for migratory water birds. And so that's where I kind of found my niche, as well as I really like pairing what I know about wetlands with what the waterfowl. And in the West, that's a lot more challenging conversation because, like we talked about arid systems, we have this high evapotranspiration rate. And so a lot of times when you start packing water on the landscape, it's viewed as sort of waste of water because of the evaporative loss. But we got to remember all of the ecological processes that come back with that water sitting on the landscape, from water quality, water storage, groundwater recharge, attenuating those stream flows, providing habitat for fish to spawn. There's a lot of things that are tied to wetlands in these Western systems that are easily overlooked when we're dealing with challenging times.
Okay. This is a really fascinating situation, fascinating location, fascinating backstory. And you've done a fantastic job of kind of painting that picture for us. So it's September 26th. I understand that waterfowl hunting will open up. I guess the youth season already came and went, the youth weekend here last weekend?
Yes. Yep. California was 2 weeks ago. California was this past weekend.
Oregon was this past weekend?
Yep.
Okay. So I guess kind of bringing this all maybe to an end, not to an end, we're not done yet, is that you said that hunting seasons for everyone else will start here right around that 1st of October. Mm. But I guess what caught the news, which we talked about early on, is that two of the storied hunting locations in this complex will not have waterfowl hunting this fall. Lack of water. What is the obvious? Probably the obvious is that one, the lack of water. What is it that led to the closure of waterfowl hunting at those two refuges?
Yeah. So at this point in time, both those refuges are 100% dry. There's no water on either of those refuges, and so, for us to manage these, systems properly and to manage waterfowl populations, one, we need water on the landscape. And to have a hunting program, we have to have an equitable distribution of sanctuary habitat and hunting habitat. So those two things in combination sort of, were the nail in the coffin for waterfowl hunting on the refuge this year. So we need to start getting water back on there. We need to get it, and enough of it that we can provide that equitable sanctuary to huntable habitat. And it wasn't just waterfowl. I mean, I think that's important. We had to shut down our upland game hunting as well because the habitat quality for our pheasant population isn't there either. I mean, with this drought, we've lost most of our upland habitat. And so, those birds have had a tough time as well. So we had very low, we did have a little bit of water this spring. So there was a little bit of waterfowl production and a little bit of pheasant production. But both refuges were completely dry by middle of August. So we didn't have molting. We're not going to have any staging. There is still some water in the basin. Upper Klamath Lake is a large lake, and it does have some wetland habitat associated with it. And where the refuges are at up there, we are still providing hunting access to those refuges, as well as Klamath Marsh, which is just upstream of the refuge, but it's about 80% dry at this point as well. So it's had a big impact on, hunter access, and, it's going to affect how the birds migrate, because now we're going to take the way we were able to spread hunters out on the landscape. with the refuges, they're all going to concentrate in those areas that do have habitat now, and those birds are going to see, a lot heavier hunting pressure in places that they haven't experienced that kind of hunting pressure. So, the likelihood of any kind of big staging numbers is probably pretty low at this point, just due to habitat availability and pressure.
It's a pretty simple discussion. It's quite cut and dry. If you don't have water, you really can't offer waterfowl hunting, particularly in a refuge situation like that. That's amazing. You said that the birds at the other refuges might experience or will or might experience higher hunting pressure. I would imagine that pressure must be managed, though. Only certain areas, certain days, certain numbers of people. Is that the case?
Yeah, on the refuges we have on the upper lake, which they're large, but by measurement of the lake area, they're relatively small, and we do have sanctuary built within those. But a big chunk of some of those refuges are dry. Most of our sanctuary area of those refuges is dry, so most of the habitat that is available right now is open to hunting, and then most of the lake itself is open to hunting, and so there's very little sanctuary area around the lake, and so if guys do have access, they're going to be able to hunt up there, and so the pressure will be higher than it has been. One of the mitigating factors on the lake has always been, one, it was a lot easier access on the refuges, a lot of walk-in hunting. You don't necessarily need a boat or a big blind and stuff. So there's going to be some limitations to guys that can hunt on the lake, just because it's a lot more gear-intensive hunting program up there. But it's still going to shift, some of those folks that would have come up to the refuge to hunt like Tule Lake have the equipment, and they may just move north up to Upper Klamath and hunt the lake instead. But a lot of it's unknown right now. It could be self-limiting, and a lot of people don't hunt, and the birds do fine. But the habitat quality is the other issue up there. We just don't have the abundance of seasonal wetland habitat, so the food resources are relatively low. It's much more of a permanent type wetland setting. And so we do have some submerged aquatics, but because they don't experience, the same kind of drawdown some of these other more perennial systems do, it's a different type of perennial submerged aquatics. So we don't have a lot of sago or widgeon grass up there, which the birds prefer. So it's going to be hard to say. I mean, I still expect we'll see, significant birds trying to stage on Upper Klamath Lake, but I don't think they're going to stay very long. I think it'll be a pretty rapid out migration, 1 or 2 days, and then they're on their way. But we will see. But I mean, just to put things into perspective, I mean, like I said, in the 1950s, we were seeing 5 million to 7 million birds staging on, Lower Klamath and Tule Lake. Last year's peak migration between Tule Lake and Lower Klamath was 1% of those historic numbers. And they were 4% of our long-term mean. So it was already, even with some wetland habitat. I mean, we still had one sump that had water on it on Tule Lake, and we had one wetland on Lower Klamath. And then there was some flooded agricultural that happened associated with Lower Klamath. And we were able to hold some birds, but 1% with limited water, I can only expect it's going to be, minimal to no birds this year staging in the Klamath Basin.
Wow. John, out of respect for your time, I have about 2 more things that I'd like to cover. Jeff,
Sure.
Thanks for being sitting there so patient. Jeff, I'm going to let you speak for the duck hunters in that area that So for those, Steve DeBerry's a guy that we both know. You know him way better than I do, but I know Steve also. Hi, Steve. Where will hunters in that area go duck hunt? Is there somewhere else they can go, or are there other options?
Hunters in California are really hunting Idaho more and more. They're beginning to explore our state. There's not a whole lot that there is left due to the drought in the upper Sacramento area, unless you are a part of an exclusive club that has a well and you can pump your own water right onto your landscape. But then it's expensive. It's super expensive. Hunters are going further north up into the Columbia River, trying to find opportunities up there, and even further up into the Puget Sound and whatnot. But this is a western-wide drought that affects everywhere up here. Hunters have historically come to Utah with the idea of hunting the marshes along the Great Salt Lake and the Great Salt Lake itself. And this isn't even a destination they can do that with anymore because of the hardly any water we have left in the Great Salt Lake. There's only 2 marinas on the Great Salt Lake, and they're both 100% closed because they are bone dry. All of the slips are sitting on the ground. I don't even know how the airboats that historically access the Great Salt Lake, there's no way for them to get to the Great Salt Lake until it snows and we have ice on the ground, and they can run on snow and ice to eventually find water. So hunters in California and Southern Oregon, the western part of Oregon and Washington, they're just traveling further to find those hunting experiences they have in the past. The Snake River in Idaho is just clogged with hunters from everywhere. And so sadly, it's just getting fewer and far between of where you can find those hunts that you relied on, especially in the early season. And I'll say here in Utah, we're fortunate because some of the monsoons this summer in the month of August, have trickled up here to the north part of the state. And with those, agriculture returns to the Bear River, and other small rivers have been able to bless some of the freshwater complexes we have. So there's a little bit more water in those than would have been expected as our season starts this coming Saturday. And our youth season happened a couple of weeks ago. But, Joel, unfortunately, hunters are just having to go further and farther to find those hunting experiences, and it's costing them more to do so. And sadly, we have a super terrible economy that is costing them more on top of it. So here in the West, I've told you this before, and John, I don't know if it's this way where you folks live, but I've told Joel a couple of years ago that here in my neck of the woods, our irrigation companies still hire people that are referred to as ditch riders. There are people literally employed driving the canals and ditch banks of our counties, making sure farmers are only using the water for the allotted time that they've been allowed for those certain days. It is that drastic here. And it's just crazy. It is crazy. It's nuts for me to drive through the upper Sacramento Valley. And again, this is just 2 weeks ago, and see rice fields that were never even planted this year, because farmers are only allowed to burn 10% of their acreage out there because of environmental concerns with the smoke. And so if they can't flood their rice, the thatch from those rice fields is so thick that they have no choice but to not plant and just collect crop insurance. So I'm probably going on way too much, but this is a topic that's near and dear to each one of us here in the Pacific Flyway, and it truly has an effect on every one of us, regardless of the way that you pursue the ducks that we all enjoy so much.
So it sounds like there's no way to avoid the pain. You're just going to feel it, and that's unfortunate. It's my hope that people will ride this out, But I understand. I understand that's here in North Dakota, it's $3.79 gas, which is down from where it was, but that's still pretty darn expensive. It cost me over $90 to fill up my truck the other day. And yeah, it does make me think about, how far I'm going to drive, where I'm going to go, and pursue things more locally. And so it does. We all have decisions to make. And unfortunately, for some, it may mean not to duck hunt this year, which would be pretty sad. But so, John, it sounds like if we're looking to the future, there's part of that helpless, we just need to wait. And you just said it's, hopefully the water comes back. There's more snowpack in the mountains, and there's nothing you can do about that. That is literally the wait and see approach, and hopefully it's sooner than later. But you did say that CWA bought some water allocations for the complex, and you did say, I guess before the podcast conversation started, is that maybe the one thing that you can do is maybe pursue a funding source that would allow the complex to purchase additional water allocations. Is that something that you can speak to?
Yeah, I mean, we're definitely interested in that option. Any water we can get is valuable to the refuge, and if there were people willing to sell water to the refuge, we would definitely be open to that. And I think there's that's in the works. I think people are talking about that and discussing that, definitely at a higher level than I work at, but it is a reality that people see, or a solution that people see. And I think it's important. It's easy to write a depressing story about the Klamath right now, especially if you're in the wetland and waterfowl business. But I do I want to make sure I recognize that the Klamath, lacking of water right now, is full of a lot of really creative, energetic, innovative people that want to make a difference, and that's across all the stakeholder groups. We have on the refuge, we've had really cool programs where we work with agricultural producers to flood fields for 3 or 4 years, provide wetland habitat on those fields, and then they dry them out and it becomes organically certified that year. And so they can diversify their crop market and their commodity market. That's a really cool program that sort of evolved off of the refuge. It helps get wetlands on the landscape. We're working with the Klamath tribes on restoration upstream, some of our refuges upstream, to try to help with putting resiliency back on the landscape to meet refuge and cultural needs. So there's a lot of people working for solutions. It's just we're in such a tough water situation right now. Sometimes it's hard to sit around that collaborative table when everybody's really spread thin, and no matter how you go into collaboration, you always go into collaboration focused on what's most important to you, and you try to negotiate your way down to where you get to that what's most beneficial to us. And I think the Klamath is moving that way. There's more and more people trying to get engaged, trying to talk about wetlands, trying to get some of the processes back on the system, because everybody's hurting. And like I said, waterfowl and waterfowl hunting and wetlands are part of the DNA of the community, regardless of what stakeholder group you come from. We're just in a really difficult situation. But yeah, the right funding, the right ideas, the right motivations. And, I keep saying this place could be the greatest conservation success story in recent times if we could just start to get water back on the landscape. And that would be a really amazing thing to be part of.
Yeah, thanks a lot, John. So Jeff, I think what you and I are hearing, I think what we're all hearing here, is that these are really tough times. It's really out of the hands of guys like John and other managers in your part of the world. And what I'm hearing is that the steps that you can take, you're trying to take them, but it's a big, complicated issue. And I think the quickest path to remedy is just to get that water back. So again, that's a wait and see approach. Jeff, anything that you want to say, I guess, maybe more in closing? Before I fully hand you the mic, John, I would love to, we've taken a really deep dive, and we went really deep into this conversation, the history, the complexity, the current situation, history, the culture, the waterfowl hunting culture of this area. In the future, love to have you back on for a much quicker conversation, just kind of talking about the update and how things are going. Would you be interested in something like that?
Yeah, definitely. Yep, I would love to revisit it and say that there's 7 million ducks out on the refuge.
let's everybody cross your fingers and your toes. Jeff, anything for us here kind of in closing?
If I may ask just one more question about the complexes themselves, with regards to the infrastructure, John, and we don't need to go deep into this. And could you just comment on the condition of, say, the dikes, the water control structures, pumps, things of that nature? What kind of condition are those in? And do you foresee that there'd be, if we were to be blessed with just incredible snowfall for 2 or 3 years, 5 years, whatever it may be, to where you are able to get the water resources that you need to be able to care for staging birds and molting birds, is the complex in a condition to where it will be able to handle that water flow, or is there a whole bunch that would need to be done to be functional again, if you will?
That's a really good question. Right now, we are definitely starting to see a lot of deterioration of the infrastructure. like I started out, I mean, all of these systems were built on organic soils. And so a lot of the levees and, you know, the foundation of those levees are organic soils. And so as everything's drying out, we're starting to see really substantial cracking. The levees are, you know, splitting apart. Um, we're seeing pretty dramatic subsidence happening in the wetland basins as a result of all this drying. Um, we're seeing roads are splitting and cracking apart. I mean, you can't drive a lot of our roads right now safely because if your tire goes in it, you're not going to get out of the cracks. And so there is a lot of concern right now that if we don't start to get at least a minimal amount of water onto some of those basins to let that organic soil start to slowly saturate up, we could be in a really dangerous situation if that water comes too fast and too much. Yeah, I mean, time is sort of the essence right now on a lot of the refuge infrastructure to get them starting to heal themselves so we can handle that big effect. The other thing that we're seeing is with the amount of drying, and you know, we haven't really been able to have an agricultural program for 2 years on the refuges. And so there's a lot of bare soil, and that's starting to blow. Like I talked about, that organic soil starts to mineralize. And as it mineralizes, it's really subject to wind erosion. And so we're seeing, you know, entire water delivery systems are just filling with sediment. Water control structures are, you know, underneath 6-7 feet of sediment right now. Wow. So there's a lot of maintenance that needs to be done to get them cleared out and ready to handle that kind of water that would come. But yeah, I mean, we're at a critical point right now, and I am worried that if we don't start to get water back onto that soil soon, we could be in a situation that, you know, if the big event does come, which, you know, nature's nature, it's going to come. The infrastructure is not ready to handle that kind of flow and volume at this point.
Well, thank you for commenting on that. I appreciate it.
Yep.
So as if it wasn't enough, you have to try to deal with, I guess, devolving infrastructure in the meantime.
Yep, it's just never ending. It's always a surprise every day.
Okay, well, it's on your radar screen. So again, I think all the more reason for us to jump back on here. Let's fast forward. What is the next kind of season? You know, is there a wet season, a dry season? What's the next season ahead of us?
Yep. So we're trending into our wet season now. You know, fingers crossed. We start to get precipitation in September. So, you know, we want those good September, October rains to start coming and getting the system. What we would like to see is get a good soaking precipitation and get the soil nice and wet so it can freeze, get a good frost in it, and then get a lot of snow in the mountains. And so when that snow, you know, hopefully it stays cold, stays cold till June, we start to see that snow release. And yeah, June's kind of late May, early June is sort of our critical period. We want to see that water starting to come off, and you know, hopefully we get just a, you know, 150% of normal snowpack, and there's too much water to handle, and it all starts to trickle across the landscape. But yeah, the next 6 months are critical for us.
Okay. Well, maybe we'll talk late winter, but at the very latest, let's get you back on here that April, May time period next year and see how things are shaking out.
Sounds good.
John Vradenburg, thank you so much for your time. I apologize for the time zone debacle. It was kind of the funny thing is the three of us are each on a different time zone, and I don't think we ever had that discussion. So we weren't all on the call at the same time, but we regrouped and made it happen. So thank you both, Jeff. Thanks for your time. Good to catch you. It looks like you're in your home office, not on the road, so a rare moment at home. So thank you both. If anybody has questions listening, you can reach out to the podcast at podcast.deltawaterfowl.org. My email address, jbryce@deltawaterfowl.org, and I will pass the question on to John. Jeff Adams has the same email, jadams@deltawaterfowl.org. But in the meantime, thanks, everybody. Thank you both.
Thank you.